Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I am making this video for students in my Introduction to Philosophy class at College of DuPage in fall 2025. We're currently wrapping up a unit on ethics, and you all have an in-class assignment on ethics to complete. There are 4 questions on the assignment. We went through a number of these in class, not quite all of them. I've been making some videos to review and supplement the material that we covered in class. In this video, I'm going to address question number 3. Here it is. In class, we consider 10 arguments against relativism about ethics. Really, cultural relativism is what we're focusing on here. Identify and explain 3 of these arguments, including the argument from horrendous evils. What do you think of these arguments? Do you find any of them persuasive? Why or why not? All right, I actually started making a video on this topic last night, and it got so long at a certain point that I decided to pause it, to stop it. And it turned out that in that video, I covered question number 1, and so I'm letting you use that to review and supplement material relating to question number 1, but it also helps set things up for this video. Right, so quickly, we went through a number of these arguments in class. We didn't go through 10. Actually, in this video, I plan to go through 12. We'll see how the time goes. If the video starts running real long, I will cut things short. I'm hoping to move through this material pretty quickly. Again, we did cover a number of these arguments in real detail in class, so I feel okay doing that. And again, I covered some preliminary information relating to these arguments in the first video. I reviewed our 4 basic meta-ethical positions: non-cognitivism, nihilism, relativism, and moral objectivism. And again, there's different versions of relativism depending on what you're relativizing to: individuals, cultures, something else. I'm not going to review that here. Go see the first video for that. All right, just a few more things before we get into the arguments here. I will say again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, always in philosophy, and really always in all of our college courses, our walks of life, politics, religion, work, finances, you name it, we're trying to figure out what is true, what to trust. We may not have 100% proofs. We want to do our best. We want to make sure we've got something that's good enough, and we want to make sure it's the best option for us to follow, right? And so a question arises, how do we do that? Well, this is where we want to start considering evidence. We want to start considering arguments. We want to start considering reasons for or against certain beliefs, for or against certain courses of action. This involves testing claims. Again, a lot of the times when someone asks us a question, a lot of times about something relating to politics, religion, science, whatever it is, a lot of times we feel this pressure to just give an answer, even if we don't have any experience in that area, even if we haven't studied it. A lot of times we feel pressure to engage in confirmation bias, to just say whatever idea comes into our head that confirms whatever it was we believed before, even if it's a very weak argument, and then very weak piece of evidence. Or when people give us pretty good arguments against something we've believed, we don't want to change our beliefs. So we just find ways of dismissing the challenge, even if we have to go through 19 forms of mental gymnastics to do so, and we criticize anybody else for going through half that, right? Our habits are not always great. At the same time, I think a lot of times we do a lot of really great philosophy. We do a lot of great critical thinking. It's not all good. It's far from all bad. And all of us have room to improve. And I want us to be critical here, but we got to be careful about being too hard on ourselves as well. Anyhow, so it's a good question for us. How do we test an idea then? How do we know if it's good or not, if it's reasonable or not? There's a lot of ways to do this. So in science, we talk about the scientific method, but really there's no one method in science. If you look at descriptions of the so-called scientific method, they pretty much always involve experiments, but not all science involves experiments unless you weaken the word unless you weaken the word experiments to the point where it doesn't even have any content anymore, which is sometimes what people will do. Oh, no, it really does all involve experiments, but you have to see an experiment. Basically, they're saying it doesn't have to be an experiment. They take it so loosely that then at that point, anything counts as science, right? So it's a real question about how do we do this? And I think a good way to do it is just a lot of examples. Just get a lot of practice with it. This isn't like memorizing some facts. There is some information here for certain you want to learn and keep track of, but there also needs to be a lot of practice. Again, I liken it a lot to skateboarding, right? If you were to take a skateboarding class, there would definitely be facts to learn. There would be some you could call basic information, maybe about the history of skateboards, different kinds of skateboards, parts of skateboards, but also different kinds of tricks, how to do them, so forth and so on. You could learn that information, but you would also need to stand on the board, get comfortable on the board, ride the board around a bit, and try out the tricks. And a lot of it is just muscle memory and practice. Honestly, that's how learning foreign languages is. That's how it works. That's how learning mathematics works. That's how critical thinking works, logic works, philosophy works. That's how tons of things work. There is an information component. There's a skills component, a practice component. We have to engage in practice, and we have to look at examples. So you will notice a lot of the arguments that we're going to look at. What they're basically doing, not quite all of them, but a lot of them, what they're doing is they're seeking to put pressure on cultural relativism in much the same way a lot of arguments in science are intended to put pressure on a certain scientific view. You're looking at the view, you're looking at the claim, the theory, the hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, right? And then you ask yourself, okay, if that thing were true, what should I expect to see? What should I expect to see? What predictions does it yield? What is it telling me about the world? Right? A lot of these theories, hypotheses, they're going to yield some kind of prediction or tell us something about the way the world is. It's actually a little bit complicated whether all scientific theories, interpretations really yield testable predictions. I think the answer to that is no, at least depending on how narrowly you understand prediction and testing predictions, right? But it's still going to tell us something about the world that we could try to make sense of in some way, test in some way, use some kind of logic, some kind of critical thinking, right? But plenty of hypotheses and theories, they're going to yield predictions that we can test more or less concretely, right? And what we want to do here is we want to ask, first of all, so what is the claim? What is the theory? What is the hypothesis? Whatever you want to call it. What is it really saying? Do I understand it? Do I understand the terms? Do I understand what it's telling me? And then what is it telling me about the world? And is that right? What kind of predictions is it yielding? Are those predictions borne out? And what we don't want to do is say, well, I could see 10 predictions, different predictions this theory makes. I'll test one, and if it passes the first test, I'm just going to declare it proven. Now let's test more than one. If it can't pass even a single test, that's really bad. If it passes one or two and then doesn't pass any others, is that a deal breaker? Well, this actually gets a little bit tricky. We might want to ask ourselves, could it be we need to adjust the theory? Have we really properly understood it? It's a little bit tricky here, actually, right? We don't want to engage in confirmation bias and just wiggle out of any potential problem. But we do want to recognize that sometimes the first time we frame an idea, we didn't quite do it right, and yeah, it didn't pass some tests, but really there's just a better way to understand the theory, and when we do that, it does pass. Yeah, it gets a little bit complicated, right? And all of the arguments I'm going to present, of course, they could be debated from different angles. Of course, a cultural relativist can come back and say, yeah, but I don't think you quite got my theory right, or yeah, you kind of did, but here's what I could say in response. And we're not going to have time to go round again on all these arguments. I will here and there try to sketch what I think a cultural relativist might say. I think all of these are, at least a lot of these arguments, a good number of them, I do think at the end of the day, you go round for round. Cultural relativism really is in a spot of trouble. It really is in a spot of trouble. Okay. And the arguments, I think, can be developed even more strongly than often I'm stating them here in the face of objections. But you just have to work off what's presented here, and you can work out for yourself on the basis of that. That's how it goes. But what you'll see is not all, but a lot of the arguments I'm going to present, objections I'm going to present, they take the form of modus tollens. So what is modus tollens? Well, let's start with modus ponens. These are basic inference forms in logic. They're deductively valid. You'll find like one or two philosophers that'll question that, but basically all philosophers, scientists, who deal with logic, academically, mathematicians, computer scientists, we're going to agree these inference forms are valid, even paradigms of validity, right? So what is modus ponens? Modus ponens is the argument form, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Now, order doesn't matter to validity in classical logic, so you could also write it like this, say it like this. P, if P then Q, therefore Q. I'll go back to the old version, original version I just mentioned a moment ago. If P then Q, that's premise one. Premise number one, if P then Q. Premise number two, P, conclusion, Q. Let's look at examples. Let's always do that. Here is an example. If I am a professor at COD, then I work for COD. That seems right. 2, I am a professor at COD. Conclusion, I work at COD. Now again, validity just means that if the premises are true, then a conclusion must be true. Validity doesn't say the premises are true. Sound means valid plus the premises are true, in which case the conclusion must be true. But validity is just saying if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Here it turns out the premises are true, okay, both of them. And the argument is valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So here the conclusion follows, right? Let's look at a related argument form. This is modus tollens. If P then Q, premise 1, not Q, premise 2, conclusion, not P. So here's our example. If I am a professor at COD, then I work for COD, 1. I do not work for COD, 2. Conclusion, I'm not a professor at COD. It's valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion's got to be true. If it's really true that if I'm a professor at COD, then I work at COD, now that's actually true, that's right. And if it's also true that I do not work at COD, now that's actually false. Well then, but if it were true, it would have to be the case, I'm not a professor at COD. I can't be a professor at COD without working at COD. So if I don't work at COD, I'm not a professor at COD. It's valid. Deductively valid. If the premises are true, conclusion must be true. Now here we have a true premise, 1, the same from the modus ponens example we looked at a moment ago, but our second premise is false. It says I don't work at COD, but in fact I do. These argument forms are both valid, and we can use modus tollens to test positions, to test theories. We can use modus ponens to work out consequences of theories, right? Actually, at least if we're pretty convinced the theory is right, work out consequences of it, we can use modus tollens to test theories, right? How do we do that? Well, if we look at a theory, a claim, hypothesis, whatever you want to call it P, and you see that that if it's right, Q's got to be right. So it supports Q, right? It leads to Q. It implies Q, however you want to call that. Entails Q, however we want to call that. If we can look at the theory P and see that if that theory is right, then Q's got to be right. It's got to be true. But we see Q's not true. Well, then P's got to be wrong. It's got to be false. Now, again, maybe we just have to restate it or something like that. But at least as stated, the theory would have to be false, right? Really quickly, there are fallacies associated with these valid forms. So I'll mention a fallacy right now. I just want to show you got to be really careful. You got to kind of mind your P's and Q's. Haha, it's a bad logic joke. And one thing you would do in a logic class is you'd study the valid forms and the invalid forms, the valid forms and the fallacies, and you'd spend time trying to identify which is which and why, and it can really help your critical thinking an awful lot. But the following form, sorry, the dog has been set off. The following form is invalid. If P, then Q, not P, not Q. How do we see that's invalid? We could build a counterexample, a case where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. What would be an example? If I'm a professor at COD, then I work at COD. Okay. I'm not a professor at COD. Therefore, I don't work at COD. Because plenty of people that work at COD are not professors. I could go over this in more detail. In the interest of time, I want to move along a little bit, but you reflect on it, you could see the premises can be true, the conclusion false, then it can't be a valid argument. It's invalid. Another way to define valid inferences is they're truth-preserving. That's just to say, again, though, that if the premises are true, conclusion's got to be true. So modus ponens and modus tollens, valid. There are some argument forms that are superficially similar that are invalid. And actually, people will trip you up on these a lot. It's a good reason to study some critical thinking and study some logic. I'm just going to remind you again before we go on, a lot of what I'm going to do in these videos, not all what I'm going to do, but a lot of the arguments, a lot of the objections I'm going to offer to cultural relativism, their logical form is modus tollens. I'm going to be saying, if cultural relativism is true, then this other thing is true, but that other thing is false, therefore cultural relativism is false. The form is valid. There's really no dispute about that. The question is just, am I right that cultural relativism really has these consequences and that those consequences are bad? I'm not going to try to pull any fast ones on you, but again, these issues are a bit complicated. Practice your critical thinking, see what you think. And if you're not totally sure at the end of the day, it's okay, right? We could talk about it in class, anything you're curious about. So let's get started. Argument number one, we'll give it a name, horrendous evils. We went over this in class at length. I'm going to be a bit quick with it here. But here's how the argument goes. If cultural relativism is true, then horrendous evils are morally permitted and even morally required in some cultures. That's premise one. Premise two, horrendous evils are morally forbidden in all cultures, all times, all places, everywhere. So they're never permitted. Well, then cultural relativism is false. The core idea is that if cultural relativism is true, then there are some actions that are just plain wrong, just plain evil, just plain forbidden. And really what we mean here is objectively. Just plain wrong, forbidden, evil. So they're not permitted in any culture, anytime, any place. They're forbidden in all. But if cultural relativism is true, then they are permitted, even required, in various cultures, depending on what? Depending on what the majority of people in those cultures say. So let's look at examples. Again, we could take genocide. We could take examples like the Holocaust. Sadly, history supplies us with a number of examples of genocide, attempted genocide, right? So, if we go back to World War II, we go back to Germany, right, in late 30s, early 40s, right? As long as a majority of Germans believed the Holocaust was permitted, then it really was permitted. And if a majority thought it was required, then it really was required. Now, again, we can get in debates over how many Germans really knew, how many Germans really supported it. I'm not an historian. I will just say I've heard a number of historians who are experts in this say lots and lots of Germans knew and lots of Germans approved. Doesn't mean they would have all admitted it. If you just asked them casually, and, there could be self-deception and things as well going on. But the point is that even if we want to argue about the historical details, what cultural relativism tells us in principle is as long as the majority thought it was permitted or required, then it really was permitted or required. And we can look at slavery in the United States. I mean, there were times in the history of the United States where a majority of people supported slavery. Well, then it would have been permitted, even required, if that's what the majority thought. And you could, female infanticide, there's all manner of horrendous evils. And again, I know this is a really kind of rough, challenging example, but I use this example just to drive this home. Right? If you had a number of, child rapists who wanted to get away with it morally, not just legally, but morally, they could just form their own country. They just pool their funds, they buy an island from some country, and they form their own country on that island. And they actually wouldn't even have to be a country, I guess. It would just have to be a culture, right? And all they have to do is just recognize that they all agree, or majority agree, great majority agree, that child rape is permitted, even required. And if cultural relativism is true, then they're right. It's not just that they believe it, it's that it is that. There's a lot I could say here about trying to clarify cultural relativism and what it's really saying and what it's not. Go back to video 1 for that. Okay? If you need a refresher on that. If cultural relativism is true, then they are right. It really is permitted there. And not just they think it is. No, it really is. What they believe fixes the moral facts. There are real moral facts there. They're relative but real. Again, if that's confusing, go back to the first video. And if they say it's required, if they say that it's saintly to rape children, then guess what? They're right. And I think what a lot of us want to say is, no. That is a horrendous evil. It's just plain evil. And really what we're saying there is it's objectively evil. It doesn't matter if they think it's right. They're wrong. And again, you might say, well, we want to be careful about judging other cultures. On child rape, we're not going to do this. You might say, well, I don't want to judge people all the time. Well, go back to the first video. Maybe we have a mixed view. Actually, you go back to the video on complexity. Watch the video on complexity, video 4. That'll help sort you out on this, right? But don't we agree that at least when it comes to these kind of things, relativism cannot be right? And a cultural relativist could say, well, wait a second. On my view, I can capture what you want to say. I can capture it because on my view, yes, the child rapists, they're right. But also you're right. You're both right. So when you say they're wrong, you're also right. But that's not good enough because you're telling me I'm right and they're right. No, I'm right and they're wrong. And you might say, well, you don't want to be egotistical. You don't want to be judgy about child rape. I mean, if we can't say that's wrong, what is wrong? And then why are you accusing me of being judgmental? Like you're going to get after me for being so prideful, but you're going to give a pass to child rape? I mean, this is bonkers, right? Sorry, I like to be even keel. I like to encourage all of you to develop your own views. I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm just going to push you on something, and I will be open about it because I believe in full disclosure. I think I have an objective moral duty not to try to manipulate you. But on this, I mean, I'm trying to persuade you, but I'm being open about it. I wouldn't call it manipulation. I call it persuasion. But I'm going to be open about it. Come on, y'all. Come on. All right. That's 1. Let's move on to 2. Now 1, the horrendous evils objection, which you have to write on, that has this modus tollens form. 2 and 3, it's a bit different. I think we could cast them in that kind of a form, but that's not how I'm going to present them here. And the way I'm going to present these really, they're really, I'm not presenting these as arguments that are designed to show that cultural relativism is false, and false because it has a consequence that is false. I'm really just using these arguments, and they're connected with one another, to show that none of us really believe this theory. We just won't take it seriously. And so you might recall we went over these in class. Argument number 2 is the argument that no one reasons in accordance with cultural relativism, or we don't do so remotely consistently, and we refuse to. And how did we demonstrate that? And actually, there's a real big payoff in this. There's a real big point about payoff from this, a lesson we get from this about our humanity that I think is so important, right? Again, when I ask the class, do you think slavery is wrong? You all say yes. And then I ask why. And you start giving me arguments. We're harming people for no good reason. We're trampling on their dignity. We're trampling on their autonomy. We're using them as just tools, right? Those are arguments. I think they're all good, by the way. They're all good arguments, right? But you're giving me arguments. You're giving me evidence. You're giving me reasons. And you're appealing to considerations about the nature of human beings, the social world, things like this. If you're a relativist, why don't you just appeal to the polls? I mean, relativism says you can have reasons for why you have certain moral beliefs. It says that for sure. And then so you could appeal to the reasons. But if we believe in relativism, shouldn't we also be citing the polls? Because isn't that ultimately what makes the moral facts the moral facts? But nobody ever does that. Or, as I said in class, we do it, but only when it's convenient. If a lot of times if we take a side on a moral debate where we think, like, I don't know, 3/4 of the country's with us and we're arguing with somebody and they disagree with us, we'll say, well, most people agree with me. And we take that to like carry some weight. But when the tables are turned and we're in the minority position, we say, well, morality just doesn't work like that, which actually just says right there, we're not relativists. But in general, we don't really view the polls as probative. We don't really view the polls as deciding the ethics. We think the reasons do, and we expect those reasons to have force, like inherent force, not just because they're backed by polls or whether they're backed by polls. This shows that we really, I think, are committed to a kind of objectivism of reasons. Now, again, we can recognize there could be some cultural variations and how people reason. And, you could talk, differently to someone if like they're 6 years old versus if they're 36, people, different kinds of life experience, so forth and so on. We can recognize that our reasoning isn't perfectly objective and things like this. And again, we might want to introduce some kind of flexibility into our objectivism. See video 4 on the complexity argument. But we do view reasons as having a certain kind of inherent and so universal and objective force. And we are just constituted, whatever built us, evolution, God, both, whatever, right? We are constituted to seek reasons. We don't just want to say stuff and think stuff and do stuff. At least a lot of the time, we want to understand why we should. Is it advisable? Is it reasonable? Is it supported by good evidence, good reasons, right? We want to check ourselves and others. Even when we completely fall into conspiratorial thinking and confirmation bias and all the rest, we're still actually doing this. We're still employing reasons. We're just doing it very badly, right? We just find this irresistible. It's how we're made. It's how we're constituted. I think to this sense, we can describe people as being rational. It doesn't mean we're always rational in the sense that, we're responsive to good evidence, good reasons, that we're not just lost in confirmation and bias. Sometimes we are just lost in that. It doesn't mean we're rational in that kind of higher sense, if you will, the more normative sense. But we're rational in the sense that we do engage in practices of inquiring into reasons, asking for reasons, offering reasons. A lot of times we do this automatically, right? You visit your friend's house, you see your friend dump I don't know, 3 tablespoons of turmeric into into their tea or something, you might ask, why are you doing that? And you expect a reason. I think it might be good for my health. I don't know about 3 tablespoons, right? I just like the taste. And we might say 3 tablespoons. And if they said something like, well, I just like the taste, and then we might just let it go. But we're curious though. We want to know. And then we might start asking ourselves, geez, do I want to try that? Da 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 da. Okay. You can make, tea with turmeric, but 3 tablespoons. I guess it depends how much water you got. All right. So, again, we do learn something, I think, really critical about ourselves here. And by the way, I think this really does show how key philosophy is to our humanity. It's just part of our humanity, not just in a science classroom, not just with sports and video games, but everywhere, to engage in this practice of asking for reasons, offering reasons, so forth and so on. We're reasoning creatures like that. Well, and of course we often take a step back, like the meta level, and ask, well, which reasons are really good, which ones aren't so good, so etc. We're already off to philosophy right there. I mean, it's just our humanity, actually. Okay. Argument number 3, related to the second one, because reasons and actions are connected. Just talked about that. We don't act in accordance with cultural relativism. I always use these silly examples in class. If you're left-handed and you wake up tomorrow morning and you read in the newspaper that 85% of Americans agree that anybody who's left-handed has a moral duty to turn themselves into the police for immediate termination, you don't do it. If you do it, you got a problem. But you're not going to do it. And you're not going to do it because you say you don't care about morality. You don't think you actually have a duty, right? Well, you don't think you have an obligation here. Well, then you don't think the polls just fix obligations like that, right? We don't actually think this is true, that this is right. Actually, I'm going to go ahead. No, I'm just going to stick in order. So I was tempted to get off track, but I'm not. All right. So 4, this is objection 4. We discussed this in class. Again, I think I first encountered this argument in Hilary Putnam's book, Renewing Philosophy. Hilary Putnam was a Harvard philosophy professor, did some work in mathematics as well. I know he was there 60s. Was he there in the 60s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s? I don't know. He was at Harvard for a long time. I think I first learned about this argument. I think it was a freshman, sophomore in college, actually, when I started reading this book, Renewing Philosophy. A lot of Putnam stuff's really hard to read, by the way. But I think it was from him I learned this argument, and I've seen it in other places, that cultural relativism is it's logically inconsistent. It's logically inconsistent, right? How so? We just ask ourselves, have all cultures believed in cultural relativism? No. Many have believed in moral objectivism. Okay. So we just go to one of those cultures. The majority of people there believe in moral objectivism. They believe cultural relativism is false. So then what do we get? If cultural relativism is true, then whatever those people believe about morality is true. Well, they believe cultural relativism is false, so therefore it's false. If cultural relativism is true, it's false. You could almost run this as a dilemma, right? Either cultural relativism is true or false. If it's false, it's false. If it's true, it's false. Either way, it's false. You can liken this in some ways to another argument we talked about in class. I can make the philosophical claim, all philosophical claims are false, none of them are true, they're just opinion. Arguably, that claim cannot possibly be true. Why? Because it's a philosophical claim. And if it's true, well, then it says all philosophical claims are not true. They're just opinions, right? I think opinions can be true or false. Let's not get into the weeds on that. It depends on how we use the word opinion. But certainly there's times where we use the word opinion where we mean, maybe neither true nor false, or let's stick with that. So then if I say all philosophical claims are mere opinions, neither true nor false, If that's true, then it itself is not true. And it is a philosophical claim. So if it's true, it's not true. Can't be true, right? You can get into these things called the liar paradox, and there's all sorts of complicated analyses surrounding various kinds of paradoxes. But it does not seem this claim can be right. All philosophical claims are mere opinions, neither true nor false. It does not seem like this can possibly be true. It seems like it's logically self-undermining, right? Maybe not. It's not exactly the same thing going on, but go over to cultural relativism. If cultural relativism is true, then it's not quite as tight here. But if cultural relativism is true, then any culture that says it's false is right, so it is false. And you might say, well, no, but it would just mean that relativism is false for them. Sorry, the dog is barking. It would just mean that cultural relativism is false for them. But cultural relativism is, by definition, is true for everybody. It holds everywhere. If it doesn't hold in one place, it just doesn't hold, right? And then there's a way to try to do damage control on this or to respond and get out of it. And one way to do it, and we talked about this a bit in class, is you might try to finesse things a bit and say, well, we got to distinguish between different types of moral claims. So it's one thing to talk about what we might call ordinary moral claims, everyday moral claims, first order moral claims, such as torturing and murdering children for pleasure is morally forbidden. Or how about, I don't know, helping little old ladies across the street out of the kindness of your heart is morally permitted, definitely morally praiseworthy, maybe even morally required. We're talking about moral claims that are referencing specific actions, kinds of actions. You might call them action types. They're talking about specific kinds of actions, certain kinds of actions, that performing that action, that kind of action, or not performing it, that's morally required, permitted, forbidden. We can call that like a first order claim or a claim of practical ethics, and then we can get into debates about things like abortion, euthanasia, da. And then we can have these like higher order, you might call them normative level claims, like consequentialism, other kinds of claims that are going to give us like general principles that apply to all actions. So one might be, a type of consequentialism would be, any action X, for all actions X is morally required, permitted, forbidden, just in case it succeeds or fails in maximizing well-being. Okay, so we might say that an action is morally required just in case it maximizes well-being, and it's forbidden otherwise. So then in any set of circumstances, the only permitted action, which would be the required action, would be the action that maximizes well-being. Right. So now we're in the realm of consequentialism here. There's different forms of consequentialism. Different forms, subforms. There's debates about how to frame them, and all the rest. But if you look at a claim like this for all actions, it's not saying just murdering children for pleasure or murdering children for profit or helping little ladies across the street or even helping people across the street, right? It's saying for all actions. It's morally required, permitted, forbidden, just in case it does what? We could say it makes everybody, it maximizes the well-being of everybody overall, right? We might say, we might want to add, well, also provided it respects people's rights, it respects people's dignity, autonomy. Now I'm kind of touching here on some more general ethical theories, consequentialism, deontology, things like this, right? We're not really getting into these in class. You don't have to be familiar with this. You don't have to really understand. You don't have to recognize the references I'm making right now. You just have to recognize there's a difference between a moral claim where we say something like, torturing and murdering children for pleasure is right or wrong, right? And a general claim that it wouldn't just be talking about torture and murder for specific motives, but it's talking about all actions. Right. Now, if you got a general principle like that covers like all actions, it could help you to figure out if you think it's true, what to think about abortion, euthanasia, so forth and so on. Still, that could get kind of tricky, because if you think that, the only permitted action, which is the required action in any set of circumstances, is the one that maximizes well-being, well, then we're going to get into debates about abortion, euthanasia, how do they impact well-being, what is well-being, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not trying to make it sound like these debates are hopelessly complicated, we can't make any progress on them, but there's work that needs to be done, right? Or if we're going to talk about rights, then we have these questions too about what rights do we have, what's the scope of those rights, with abortion, do fetuses have rights, mothers have rights, fathers have rights, how do you balance all of that kind of stuff, right? What are the rights to, what happens if it seems like there's a conflict, you get it. But claims could be more or less general. And then we can even ascend to a higher level, right? Like, so suppose and this is sometimes called, Shelley Kagan, great philosopher, he talks about practical, normative, and foundational. So we're going to call this stuff foundational. You could also call it meta-ethical. The meta-ethical takes on a lot of contours, a lot of different senses, right? Shades. Suppose we like consequentialism. Suppose we're attracted to a view on which the only permitted action in any set of circumstances, which is also the required action in those circumstances, is one that maximizes well-being or maximizes the good, right? And again, let's not worry about what exactly well-being might be, or well-being and the good, how those... Again, I don't want you to get lost in the details of this. I'm trying to go over this kind of very, very broad brushstrokes, okay? Well, we could ask, well, why would you think that's true? Why would you think that's true? Would you think that that's true, because... what would the reason? I don't want to delve into actually different foundational theories. There's different views you could have about why you might think consequentialism is true, or deontology is true, or virtue ethics is true. Actually, virtue ethics it's actually a lot cleaner with virtue ethics. So if we want to say, and there's different ways to develop virtue ethics, and I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, so I'm going to say something that's very, very quick. And if you have any real background in ethics, you'll see I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. It's okay. It's just to fix some ideas here for us. We might adopt a kind of virtue ethics that says that virtue and vice are the central concepts of moral evaluation. Any particular action we want to decide, should we do it or not, is got to be determined by whether it accords with virtue or vice. If it accords with virtue, you're permitted to do it or must do it. If it accords with vice, it's vicious, you're forbidden from doing it. So then we're grounding our practical ethics in a normative ethics of virtue, and then we could ask, well, why should virtue matter? And we might say, well, one response would be a kind of egoism. Well, we should all follow virtue because it'll benefit us individually. A more altruistic view would be we should follow it because it's what helps all of us to benefit, right? But the point is, when we come to an issue like abortion, we could try to decide that on the basis of a higher level principle about, all actions. But then we've got to ask, well, why should we believe that? And so we've got this practical level, this normative level, and this foundational or meta-ethical level. And how is all this relevant to... I just got a little crash course in that. Very brief crash course, right? In kind of like ethics broadly, right? Then we'd actually have to say more about what do we mean by these virtue vice terms and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so how is this relevant to argument number 4? Well, because Putnam and others, if I recall Putnam correctly, some philosophers are arguing that cultural relativism is logically inconsistent, logically self-undermining in this way, right? And one response is to try to save cultural relativism. And again, I'm not just trying to do a mic drop and run. I'm trying to anticipate a little bit how might the cultural relativists respond. They might try to quarantine things and say, no. The culture doesn't get to decide all ethics. It doesn't get to decide whether relativism is true or not. It just is true. It doesn't get to decide cultural relativism versus subjectivism. like those, or versus nihilism or whatever. It's just what, like, cultural relativism is true. And they'll say, I'll give you reasons why you should think it's true, but it is true. Cultures don't get to decide that. That foundational bit, that's just there. They don't get to mess with that. Cultures don't get to mess with that. That's just there for them, but they could build on that. So they could say whatever they want about the practical and maybe the normative, but they don't get to touch the foundational. The foundational is just there for them. And so actually we don't get this inconsistency, because cultural relativism is not saying that the culture gets to decide about cultural relativism itself, but only about these practical claims or practical and normative level claims. The problem is a lot of philosophers recognize you can't quarantine these different levels that easily at all. They all bleed into one another. They all have logical connections with one another, so they all bleed into one another. Positions you take on abortion are going to have implications for consequentialism and deontology and further up the chain. Right? If you recognize, for example, and the culture could do this on cultural relativism, they could take a view on abortion, and also, which would imply that, depending on how you actually view, well-being, the good working out, and actually then you could just have all kinds of different cultures that take all different kind of views on abortion. So, if you think one culture's view on abortion, wouldn't thwart consequentialism, then you could find another culture that would have a view on abortion that would thwart consequentialism, right? However you think that well-being and the good shake out, it might be one culture's position on abortion, and, implies it's permitted even though it doesn't maximize well-being, doesn't promote the good, doesn't maximize the good. So the practical views have consequences for normative views, and also normative views can have consequences for foundational views. You might have for example, you might argue, for example, that consequentialism, that's saying that the only permitted action is which is the required action in the circumstances, is the one that maximizes, global well-being, maximizes well-being for everybody, overall. That if you follow that would require you to do things that don't necessarily maximize your well-being, but might maximize other people's well-being. Well, then that implies a foundational view on which ethics is grounded in like egoistic, rational self-interest is false. You could have a practical view that entails, that supports, you could have a practical view that undermines a normative view. You could have one that undermines a foundational view. You could have a practical one that supports, gives at least some support for a normative view, gives some support for a foundational view. These things they're all interwoven, they're all connected. You can't just quarantine the practical from everything else. It just doesn't work. And as I said in class too, you could think, if we think about this, our everyday ethics, we're not just making judgments about what we're allowed to do or not, but under what circumstances. Like, intentions can matter. We might say you're allowed to, to take a life if you're defending your life against an intruder, but not otherwise. We might say you're allowed to steal the bread if you're starving to death and the other person really doesn't need it, right? We could bring intention and circumstance into ethics in all kinds of ways. We're not just then saying what you're allowed to do or not, but why. I think the foundations are going to be in, but then the objectivism and relativism are part of those foundations. You can't quarantine things off like this to make things safe. And what about a culture that says something like this, which we do, which you do when I ask you, why do you think slavery is bad, and you tell me? What if we want to say that slavery is wrong because it harms people with no justification, with inadequate justification, but also we want to say it violates people's inherent dignity, their inherent autonomy. Well, doesn't cultural relativism say we should be right about that in our own culture, but then doesn't inherent autonomy and dignity have to exist and kind of support these considerations? Well, then that's subjective. And if you want to say, well, no, there would just be a failure to even get any ethics here, well, then you've got nihilism, and you don't, and maybe it's kind of a nihilism, a relative nihilism. Not everybody's got nihilism, so you still kind of have relativism. But if it turns out, which maybe it does, that all cultures on Earth basically have some kind of principles like this, then actually there's no ethics. Then we get nihilism everywhere. That's not what the relativists promised us, right? It could say a lot more about this. I'm going to move on. I think they're in a lot of trouble here, actually. All right, question number 5. We didn't cover this in class. This comes from Michael Huemer's book. Michael Huemer has this wonderful argument, and again, he's an atheist materialist philosopher. He's got this wonderful argument that cultural relativism is actually circular. So if you, and again, there's this one you could actually argue in a lot of different ways, but here it goes. Suppose you ask me to define square, and I say square is square. Anything's a square just in case it's a square. That's circular. That's not an acceptable argument. It gives us no information at all. It doesn't tell us anything at all. You could even critique it in further ways, but it's totally unilluminating, uninteresting. And if you think of definitions as offering some kind of insight or explanation, you might also, can a thing really explain itself? Why is that true? Because it's true. Well, if you wanted to say it's necessarily true, it's inevitably true, and then tell me why you think that is. If you want to say it's just true in virtue of the concepts, like why is a bachelor an unmarried male? Because bachelor just means unmarried male. That's one thing. But if I ask you why is it true, and all you say is it's true because it's true, no. Why are you doing that? Because I'm doing it. No. Why are you doing it? Because I want to. That's not really a good justification either, unless you can give me some argument why just having the desire actually would justify some kind of relativism, right? So we're not going to accept circular definitions. And then Huemer asks, well, how's the cultural relativist defining these deontic properties of morally required, permitted, forbidden? It seems like they're saying something like this. For all actions X is morally required or permitted, forbidden. Let's just do required. For all X is morally required in a culture C, just in case the majority of people in C believe, accept, say, whatever, that it is morally required. That is circular. For all X is a triangle in culture C, just in case the majority of people in C say it's a triangle. Okay, so what do they say triangle is? They say it's whatever the majority of people in the culture say it is. So what do they say it is? This is not a definition. We're not getting anything out of this. It's empty. If they can't say more than this, like, this is not good, you know. Arguably, we can start asking some questions now about what do we need to define and not, and who and where does the burden of proof lie. But you might start worrying that actually their theory is a lot more empty than they are claiming. And then so if they want to make the circularity go away, then they have to replace any reference to morally required on the right-hand side of that definition with something else. And how do you do it? And well, I know we're at like 53 minutes. Let me try to be quick here. One way you might try to do it is just say, as long, it's required just in case it makes, most people happy. And if you don't do it, it makes most people sad. But that's not even going to be close, because there's all kinds of things in a society that even that society would agree, yes, that make a lot of us happy, or it makes, if we do it, and it makes a lot of us sad if we don't. But we ourselves don't think that touches on ethics. It could just be a part of manners that doesn't rise to the level of ethics, or it might just be something completely unrelated, like painting your house some garish color. It might, if you do it, it might make a lot of people sad, but it doesn't mean they have to think that it's unethical to do it. So they themselves would say, if you don't, if you do it, it makes a lot of them sad, but they don't think it has anything to do with morality. Well, then they should get to decide what the extent of morality is if cultural relativism is true. So it doesn't actually work. And you try to run through the alternatives here, and it doesn't seem any of them really work. And so it's not clear that the relativists can actually solve this problem of circular definition. All right, let's move on. I got to be fast here. 6. Argument 6 is you can't make sense of moral progress on cultural relativism. We all think there has been moral progress. We all might want to see a lot more. Some of us might worry about regress, but we all believe there's been some moral progress. So there are forms of slavery that persist today, but the kind of state-sanctioned slavery that we used to have in the United States, that doesn't exist anymore. We tend to think that's a good thing. I hope we think that's a good thing. We had a bad belief. Now we got a better belief. That's progress, right? Well, to judge progress, doesn't this require some kind of standard against which progress or regress are to be judged? Doesn't that standard have to be objective? If it's subjective, what could it be? Right? And you might worry that ultimately, at the end of the day, all the relativists really has to go on, whatever they try to say here, whatever I don't want to be too like tendentious here or, biased, whatever show they try to put on. At the end of the day, you might argue it's just a numbers game. And so really all they can say is, we made progress on slavery because it used to be most people believed slavery was permitted, even required, and only a few believed it was forbidden. And then we went from that kind of scenario to a scenario where most people believe it's forbidden, and it's only a small minority that believe it is permitted or required. Okay? But that cannot possibly be moral progress. It can't just be a numbers game. Why not? Here's an example. One thing that's been pretty constant in our societies from the beginning is people have agreed, the overwhelming majority of people have agreed, that murdering people for fun is bad. Well, maybe there's a minority that thinks that's wrong. So if tomorrow the minority becomes the majority and a majority of people start to say murdering people for fun is totally cool, that would be progress? I think we'd say that's massive regress. And then if we want to keep making progress even on slavery, what does that mean? That we could just flip-flop back? I mean, I'd maybe say no because, progress has to just go in one direction or whatever. But you can't make sense of progress just off the numbers. All right, so that's 6. 7, if cultural relativism is true, then the kind of deontic status, whether an action is morally required, permitted, forbidden, can actually change just based on a coin flip. It could change way too easily. So you can imagine a culture. There's 101 people, and let's just say it's just any majority decides. Simple majority decides the morality. So you need 51 of the 101 people to fix what's morally right, wrong, good, bad, required, permitted, forbidden. And so imagine now that the society, 50 people think slavery is always wrong, and 50 people think it's permitted, maybe even required. And there's one person who they're just not sure. And suppose they're like, suppose they're just really indecisive. And like at noon, they're like, I think actually slavery is bad. Well, then it is bad. And then a minute later, 12:01, like, no, I think that was too quick. I think it's okay. Well, then it's okay. And then at 12:02, no, I think it's actually not good. Well, then it's not good again. No, I think it's okay. Then it's okay again. The actual moral law would flip-flop like that just based off that person's indecision. I mean, that seems like bonkers. And if you think about it, if the issue is whether you could like stab somebody whose shoes you don't like, so you're one of the people who wants to stab somebody because you don't like their shoes, and you got to just watch this indecisive person, and when they say, well, I don't think we should do that, then you're evil if you do it. But then we're like, no, I changed my mind. You can do it. Then you could just stab away, and you're. I mean, that's what are we talking about? Morality cannot work like this. That's number 7. 7 is on cultural relativism. Morals are just, they can change too easily, too quickly, too flimsy of a basis. So the theory can't be right. 8, this is actually going to kind of tie back to 2 and 3. How could sheer agreement yield a moral duty? On cultural relativism, just the sheer fact people agree yields a duty. So imagine, I don't know, our whole class crash lands on an island. And, I don't even say I'm going to give you homework. I don't even try to be the boss or anything. But, I don't know, a majority of you are worried I might try to give you homework. And so you agree that you must kill me? Now you're required to do it? That seems bonkers. That seems bonkers, right? How could just agreeing you have to do something mean you must do it? You know, that just seems wrong. A related issue, this is 9, is that on relativism, as long as you believe you're in the right, you're guaranteed to be right. You're infallible. You're infallible as long as you never question yourself, right? So let's switch to individual relativism for a minute. Every individual gets their own morals. So I get my own morals, right? And now I say, I really want to rob a bank, but I think it might be wrong. Well, as long as I say it's right, it is right, but I got to really think it's right. So as long as I really think whatever I do is right, I am right. I'd really like to murder that person and steal their shoes. Well, I think it would be great. Well, now I'm allowed to. If I think it might be wrong, well, then maybe it is wrong. So in order to come out in the clear, morally at least, I mean, the police might disagree, I might go to jail, but at least to come out in the clear morally, all I have to do is have no conscience, question nothing, and just assume I'm God. I think we want people to do the opposite with morality. You know, one class I said, really interesting theme of Lord of the Rings, at least according to some commentators, is, you know, the good guys like Gandalf and Galadriel and Aragorn, they all have an awareness that they're not morally perfect and they're subject to self-deception and corruption. So when Frodo tries to hand the ring to Gandalf, he won't take it. When he tries to hand it to Galadriel, she won't take it. Because they recognize that even if they're generally good people and they would have good intentions, it would corrupt them and they would actually do bad things with it. They can appreciate they're not morally perfect and hedge against their own moral failings. And everybody wins because of that. That's such a great quality to have. The bad guys, like Sauron, actually think they're the good guys and never question themselves at all, and they end up like causing massive evil, right? We don't want people, and the same thing applies here for individuals that apply for countries. As long as a country, the majority says, no, we really are convinced genocide is right, then it's got to be right for them. Don't we want people to like question themselves a bit on this kind of thing? But on cultural relativism, there's no obligation to question anything at all unless you say there is. So just say there's no obligation to question at all, and then just don't question. And you can't possibly be wrong. You're infallible as long as you don't question and as long as you don't obligate yourself to question. And then you're always right. I just don't think that could be true. I think actually cultural relativism, I would argue, it actually does collapse into nihilism. This is not a theory of ethics. They're saying they're not just doing description, they're doing norms. No, they're not. They're just doing description. They can't capture norms. Norms are more robust than what they think they can give us. I said 12, we're almost done. We're on 10. On relativism, genuine moral disagreement is impossible. Right. So if we go back to individual relativism again, I get my morals, you get your morals. Now you take one position on abortion, I take the other. You take a position on euthanasia, I take the other. Immigration, flag burning, whatever, da 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 da. And I don't know, maybe you're left, I'm right, vice versa. You know, you're right, I'm left, or whatever it is. Right. We've got our different positions. And we're sitting here arguing with one another. I mean, hopefully we're actually being polite, you know, in that sense of argument. Hopefully we're being respectful, listening, learning, growing, right? But we disagree, let's say. At least we think we disagree. We think we have different views. But on cultural relativism or individual relativism, cultures can't really disagree and individuals can't disagree. Go to ice cream, right? We could have different paradigms for relativism, for subjectivism, but go over to ice cream. A lot of us are subjectivists about ice cream. We're relativists about ice cream. And what we mean by that is that if I say chocolate's good, even though I didn't literally explicitly say chocolate's good for me, we say that's all you really mean. So when I say chocolate's good, I'm not actually saying it's just good across the board. There's this fancy French term, tout court. I'm not like saying it's good tout court, right? If I said it even right. If I didn't, forgive me, French, right? You're just basically saying that you like it. And then someone else says, well, chocolate's bad. Well, they're not really disagreeing with you. They're just saying they don't like it. And it's true that you like it and they don't. There's no contradiction there. There's no clash there. if we really think through our subjectivism about ice cream, we can't really disagree about whether ice cream's good or bad. We're just saying whether we like it or not. Well, everyone gets to decide for themselves, whatever, except actually they don't really quite get to do that in a fully free manner anyhow, but you get it. On individual relativism, you and I actually don't disagree about abortion or euthanasia or anything. Because all I'm really saying is I think it's right for me. All you're saying is you think it's right for you. I'm just saying I think it's wrong for me. All you're saying is you think it's wrong for you. Whatever it is that we're saying, we're not actually talking about this thing that would apply to you and me. We're just talking about our own preferences. And we each get our own preferences, and there's no logical clash between them. For me to say I like chocolate, that doesn't entail anything about whether you have to like it or not. It turns out that moral disagreements on cultural relativism, individual relativism generally, are impossible. It just doesn't seem like that. It seems like, no, we really, really, really can genuinely disagree on some stuff. Well, then the relativism's got to be wrong. All right, let's wrap up. I would say another problem with relativism is it doesn't care about how we arrive at our beliefs, not ultimately. Right. So again, go back to this situation where we have 101 people, and 50 are on one side and 50 are on the other, on slavery, abortion, whatever it is. Okay. And there's one holdout. If the one goes to the one side, the morals go that way. If the one goes the other side, the morals go that way. How do they arrive at their view? They could just flip a coin. They could consult the magic 8-ball. They could be bribed. They could be bullied. It doesn't seem like they could just make a random guess, a random choice. It doesn't seem like the morality for a whole society or even an individual should be able to be decided that way. It's too thin. Now, the individual or the society could set things up so that you're duty bound to follow a certain procedure, but they could change their mind on that tomorrow. Nothing's stopping them. And then doesn't matter how they came up with that. Okay, let's not follow that train. It's just too thin. The basis of it all is too thin. Again, and this even ties back all the way back to argument 2. We want reasons, not coin tosses or random guesses or being bribed or bullied to decide what's right or wrong. A relativism, at the end of the day, it really lets anything in principle decide right or wrong. That's no good. Last objection. How do we carve the cultures? We talked about this in class. So again, one of you gave the example of the Kurds. We have peoples on this earth we could identify as a culture. They would say they have a culture. We would agree they have a culture. They could have a language or languages, but they don't have their own country. The Kurds are an example, Kurds. You could go read about them. There's Kurds in Iraq and I think Syria, Turkey, Lebanon. I don't know. They're a stateless people. So do they get their own morals, or are the morals for them dictated by the countries in which they live? I like to use this example of people living in a part of the rainforest in Brazil that have had very little, maybe no contact with the outside world. Maybe at this point they've all had contact, but at least a couple decades ago, at least a century ago, that wouldn't necessarily have been true. So do they get their own morals because they're in their little pocket? And they're kind of isolated from the outside world, or because they live in these national boundaries, their morals are completely dictated by people outside. They don't even know who those people are, what those morals are. And then if you're like, well, I don't like that, they should get their own morals, then does every little pocket get its own morals? Does my neighborhood get its own morals? Does my side of the street get its own morals? How many cultures do we have in the U.S.? Should we even let national boundaries decide this? At the end of the day, we don't actually know how to count the cultures. Then actually, we don't actually know what's right or wrong. Cultural relativism, an advantage, is we're supposed to be able to know what's right or wrong, solve that epistemological challenge. That's from question number 2 on the assignment. I did a video on that. It's supposed to give us this advantage, and we just consult the polls. But I don't know whom to poll. I don't know where the cultures stop and start. Actually, I could draw cultures all kinds of places. I could be in 1,000 different cultures, 10,000, 1,000,000 different cultures, and which one actually is relevant to my morals? What about you? I don't know. I don't think there's a good answer to this. I don't think the theory is really workable at the end of the day. And then we could ask questions too about how strong does a majority have to be? 51%, 52, 53%, or 52.47%? If you can't decide that, what do you do? Do you have a remotely non-arbitrary way to answer that? I think that's actually really challenging for them. I think it's a real problem for them. These are 12 objections. 12. We can actually do more. I have more on my sheets, but we're going to stop here with 12. You have to write on 3, including the first one, but then you get your choice. And as I said in the video that became the video for question number 1, you don't have to think any one of these arguments, any one of these objections is 100% proof against cultural relativism to think cultural relativism is basically sunk, right? If you just think a couple of these are like at a 7 or 8, maybe a 9 on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 meaning the argument doesn't touch at all, 10 it's a refutation, cultural relativism is pretty much donezo. And I think a lot of us would agree it's donezo. Now again, we could have worries, concerns, questions. Don't we want some kind of flexibility? Doesn't it mean we need some kind of relativism? See the video on question 4, the argument from complexity against moral objectivism. I argue there the moral objectivist can handle all the flexibility we want. The cultural relativist actually can't. We might have these other arguments. Well, I believe in democracy. Doesn't that mean I'm a relativist? I would say no, not at all. Again, really, you need objectivism for democracy, not relativism. Shouldn't we not judge? Yes and no, depending on the type of judging. And actually, to make sense of that, I think you need objectivism, not relativism. Now, I'm not giving you their arguments here because of time. If you're curious, come talk to me. Come talk to me. I'm happy to talk with you about it. And again, we might wonder, well, if there really are objective morals, what are the right morals? Well, let's engage in arguments about that. That's what we do anyhow. Let's look at the evidence and the reasons. That's what we're going to do anyhow. Of course, we want a good version of objectivism, not a bad version, right? And we might want to know where the ethics come from. Well, some would say they come from God, and that's maybe what we should go for. Others would say we don't need to go that far. We could turn to nature. I would say not evolution, because that's going to give us relativism, a really brutal version of it. But maybe we could, look at, features of our psychology and sociology to try to do this. Maybe we could look at principles of logic and rationality. There's a lot of options here, actually, that we could turn to try to provide a basis for objective ethics. And some would say at the end of the day, they're not sure where they come from, but one thing they are absolutely certain of, that they will, it doesn't have to mean they're 100%, they believe they have 100% logically convincing proof. They can recognize someone could question it even though they understand all the terms of the argument, but they're going to base their life on it, that kind of certainty. We shouldn't be torturing and murdering children or really anybody for pleasure or for profit. Even if we can't, at the end of the day, 100% prove that or say exactly where that comes from, we can give arguments. I did that in the other video, the video for question number 2. We can give arguments for sure. But, again, appealing to, human worth, appealing in turn to free will, consciousness, experience of pain, creativity, all these wonderful things about us, appealing to human dignity, appealing to human freedom, all these things. That still isn't telling us where we get our dignity, where we get our freedom. Is that God, nature, logic, what? But even if we're not 100% certain or really, really clear at all on the ultimate grounds of where these duties come from, I think we are still entitled to be really confident that certain things are right or wrong. And even if there's a lot of hard questions, I think we're still entitled. And this real quick analogy, there's sometimes this idea, which I don't think is right, that if a theory in some way or other logically presupposes a more fundamental theory, then the dependent theory can only be as justified as the lower level theory. That's a pretty natural, logical thought to have, but that could get you in a lot of trouble. A lot of philosophers and mathematicians would want to argue we could be a lot more confident that 2 + 2 = 4 than we can in any particular metaphysics of mathematical objects. We don't have to be as confident about our philosophy of math as we are about 2 + 2 = 4 to be really confident that 2 + 2 = 4. I'm not saying we shouldn't do philosophy and math. I'm not saying it should never lead us to revise even radically our views on mathematics, but I think we're pretty good in believing 2 plus 2 equals 4 even before we start doing all that philosophy of math. And if at the end of the day we're not really sure exactly what we should say about the metaphysics of numbers, I think we could still be pretty confident 2 plus 2 equals 4. Believe it or not, there's actually a philosopher out there, Hartree Field, that I think gave a pretty good argument that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is false. And I think actually we should take that pretty seriously too, but I'm too honest for my own good. At the end of the day, I would go on to say, with respect to other field, I think we should say 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. And I think we could be really confident we could trust our eyes before we've got a theory worked out for that. And yeah, we do want to be careful here, because then we might say, well, I'm pretty confident we should just kill people that are left-handed. I don't need to defend. No, we're not saying we don't have to give any arguments or defend ourselves at all. We can give lots of good arguments for why we shouldn't kill anybody for pleasure or profit. I'm just saying we don't need to have 100% proof of that. And we don't have to like engage in this infinite series of why questions. Well, why think that? Well, why think that? Well, why think that? On and on and on forever. And at the end of the day, even if we're not sure whether we think these morals really come from God, nature in some sense, logic, rationality in some sense, I think we can and should be really confident that it's just never okay to do some of these things. And maybe it's always okay to do some things like, help a little old lady across the street, right? All right. Thanks for making it to the end. If you did, I will see you in class. Peace.